There are many things that a student can do in order to be successful in Chem 1142 lab. Some of the biggest things that you can do is coming into lab with an understanding of the role that your IA plays in the lab. You also need to understand how you can be sure that your experiment will work and what it actually means for an experiment to work. And lastly, you need to understand the lab timeline and stick to it every time. The role that your IA plays in Chem 1142 lab is probably quite different from what you've seen in Chem 1141. Your 1142 IAs have been trained to follow a specific kind of Socratic method with their students, and at all times, their goal is to make sure that you are working towards becoming independent in lab. So, the role of your IA. Your IA's job is to inform you of necessary safety information, including specific hazards within the protocol. They will guide you through tough spots in the procedure. So in their pre-lab lecture, they will let you know, step 6 is particularly tricky. Here are things that you can do to make sure that it goes well. Or here is a common misconception in this procedure. They can sometimes help you troubleshoot your experiment. There are lots of things that students do regularly every semester, and we know to expect them. So your IA has been taught what those things are, they know how to recognize them, and they can help you troubleshoot many of the experiments. They will point you in the right direction, and they will encourage you to work individually. One of your IA's biggest jobs is to help you get out on time. Every day we have labs that are running back to back throughout the entire day. So if the first lab gets out late, then the second lab starts late, which means they will get out late. And then all day, our labs will be late. So the IAs are told over and over that it's important that they get all students out on time. Your IA will not do the following, and this is because we, the coordinators, have told them not to. Your IA will not tell you what to do next. If you ask them what you're supposed to do next, they will ask you a question in return. They may ask you, what do you think you should do next? They may ask you, what was the last step you did? Or can you show me in your lab manual where you are in the procedure? This is not to be mean. It's not because they don't know what to do. It's because you are supposed to be working towards becoming independent in lab. So your IA is not going to tell you what to do next. They're going to try and ask you questions so that you can figure it out. Your IA also will not give you answers or check your answer. If you ask for an answer to a post-lab question, they're going to ask you, well, what do you think? What did you observe in your experiment? If you ask them to check your answer, they're going to say, well, how did you get to that answer? Or can you explain your logic? How did you come up with that idea? Your IA cannot do certain things. And these are not cannots as in your IA doesn't have these capabilities, but more like people in general do not have these capabilities. For example, your IA cannot always tell you what you did wrong in an experiment. There are so many variables at play in an experiment, and when you have 20-something students in a lab, a lot of times, students miss steps, and if it's not a common thing that we see, it's very possible that your IA will not be able to look at your experiment and say, this is what you did wrong. It could be that your glassware was dirty and you didn't clean it properly before you moved on to a next step. It could be that you left out a reagent. It could be really anything. So probably 9 times out of 10, if you messed up your experiment, the only solution is to start over. Your IA also cannot fix your experiment for you. They are not supposed to fix your experiment for you. If you've messed up, they will help you troubleshoot if they can, but it is your job to make sure that your experiment goes well. And your IA is not going to put their hands on your experiment and try and solve it for you. Let's talk about how to make your experiment work. First, make sure that you follow the directions. This seems like common sense, but we always have students who take a little shortcut or they skip over some steps. A lot of the experiments are written out as like step 6A, B, C, D. Those steps A, B, C, and D are there for a reason. You still have to read them, you still have to do them. Any directions that are in a little box are still directions. You do not skip over them. Also, you'll notice that a lot of procedures are given to you the first time that you see them, but then when you see that procedure appear in a later experiment, it's just a standard operating procedure at that point. It's something that you're expected to know. If you still need that information, you can go to the appendix at the end of the lab manual and get those little detailed instructions. Always make sure that you wash your glassware well. Any contamination left over from a previous student can and most likely will mess up your experiment. So even though you've received your kit from the stockroom, make sure that you first check that everything that's supposed to be in that kit is in fact in that kit. If it's not, you need to let the stockroom know so that you can get that equipment and also avoid any potential charges. You also need to make sure that it's not damaged, and you also want to double check that it's clean. Just because it was turned into the stockroom and checked does not mean that it actually is perfectly clean. And you want to make sure that your experiment is not potentially affected by something that's left over. You should not depend on your IA to get you through the experiment. If you are constantly asking your IA for verification or confirmation that you're going in the correct direction, or asking your IA what the next step is, you will run out of time. Your IA is looking out for all 20 of their students. They are not able to focus on you, so you will be waiting for them if you are constantly asking questions, and you will not finish. You need to make sure that you know what you are doing in this experiment before you get to lab. Lab should never ever be the first time that you are reading through an experiment fully. Every week you will receive an announcement that tells you what the pre-lab work for the experiment is. Make sure that you do those things on your own, that you are not copying someone else's. Typically, we can tell when students have copied from someone else because they show up to lab, they have all their pre-lab work done, but they have no idea how to use it. So make sure that you make a plan outside of lab so that you can execute it inside lab. Do all the difficult work before you get there so that lab is smooth sailing. And then last thing, these procedures work. None of these experiments are new. They've been tested over and over at Texas State, and also these experiments were not typically made up from scratch. These are experiments that are time tested across many universities for decades. If you tell me that the experiment does not work for you, it is typically because you made a mistake. You left out a reagent, you skipped a step, you misunderstood the instructions. So if something does not work, don't get upset. Ask your IA to see if they can help you troubleshoot it, or maybe go back through the instructions and see if you can find the place where you left something out. But usually if you make a mistake, you do have to start over. So last thing, know and follow the lab timeline. So this is based on like a 0 o'clock start time. Your lab starts at 0 minutes. That's when you will be allowed into the lab. With 15 minutes into the lab, you will be done with your check-in. That's your IA checking that you are dressed appropriately for lab, and checking your calculations at the door. And then your IA will also deliver a pre-lab lecture. At this point, you'll be sent to the stockroom to check out a kit if we are using kits that week. By 25 minutes into the lab, you should have your kit in the lab, and you've already checked the contents of the kit to make sure that everything is there, and you are ready to start the experiment. By 2 hours and 25 minutes into the lab, you should be done with the experiment. None of these experiments should take longer than 2 hours. If they do, usually it's because the student wasn't 100% sure what they were doing. All of these experiments are doable well within the window of the lab. At this point, you should be cleaning your kit and working on returning it to the stockroom. Also, a pointer, if you can clean things as you go through the experiment and let them dry, you're less likely to get sent back down with a dirty bin. At this point, you can start working on finishing your lab report. You always should work on your lab report after you've already taken your kit back to the stockroom. At 2 hours and 50 minutes, your lab is over and you are out of the lab. At this point, if you are not done with your experiment, your IA will collect your lab report. and ask you to leave the room so that the next lab can come in. Remember, you're always welcome to be ahead of this timeline or even super ahead of this timeline, but never behind.